Welcome back, everybody. It's Jen Budd, your former senior Border Patrol agent with the United States Border Patrol, now immigrant rights activist. And today I have one of my most favorite people in the whole world, Mo Goldman. He's an immigration attorney in Tucson, Arizona. And we like to pal around and get in trouble out in the desert sometimes. And, um, and then have pizza and drink beer afterwards and stuff.
Yeah,
How are you doing today, Mo?
I'm doing great. And also, I am owner of the largest headphones in southern Arizona. Look at the
Are
size of
you?
this.
I don't know if
Yeah.
we're going to do the video on this. We'll see how
Yeah,
long it
well,
goes.
if we don't do the video, just envision Princess Leia uh, with with a beard
With
and a
black
bald
buns on the side of your
and
ears.
a bald head, and you will know what my headphones look like. They do look like buns.
Yeah,
Anyways,
absolutely. So let's see. You have written a book just like I have, and I was on your podcast, Immigration Ain't Easy, not too long ago, which I highly recommend to people. But your book is called The Last Survivor: Lessons from the Past and the Dying Dream of Freedom. This is what it looks like. Um, this woman on the front, there you go, you got it too.
I'm
This
holding
woman
it
on
up
the
also.
front is Esther, and she is your grandmother who survived the Nazi occupation of Poland. And I just give a little bit of background to it. She was born in Opatow, Poland. And this is, you were saying, in the southern region of Poland. Her father died when she was 2 years old, and she grew up with her mother, her sister, and brother, and her mother's mother, her grandmother. Um, I was reading in the book that you said the German occupation started in Apatow in 1939, correct?
That is correct.
But then you also have like in 1941 is when they established the ghetto.
Yeah.
So she was allowed to, how
It
did that work?
was it
They
was
made
kind of
them
a
wear the
gradual.
stars first,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, it was
Okay.
a gradual if you look at it as like a ladder, they were taking steps into greater dehumanization. Let's start by making them wear these badges. Let's put them behind a wall and keep them confined, and then let's kill
I think you had, there were several quotes that you had, and I think one of them that speaks to that is you were saying the economic deprivation is a form of persecution, and here is where the U.S. is complicit, and we'll get into that later. But it's just a constant, because at first didn't they say that Jewish people couldn't have certain jobs, right? So then all of a sudden you lose your job, and so they start cracking down economically on them way before they get to gas chambers and things like that, right?
Yes, it's a progressive dehumanization that has went on, looking at different ways to target a population of individuals, and eventually it becomes a genocide, unfortunately. And that, is why you'll see a lot of people who are fleeing persecution types of scenarios when they find a new place to live, like the United States. They want to, have that opportunity, and that drive that exists by being, a new immigrant in a country where you now have this newfound freedom to be able to start a business or work and have that economic success that you weren't able to have. And that's kind of, I mean, just tying it into some of the immigration things that I talk about in that book, we now see in our own country, on a different type of level, the hindrance of economic success for immigrants or migrants because they can't obtain certain documents that allow them to legally work in the US.
How did she survive after her father died, and how did her mother support them?
I'm not 100% sure. I think there was a lot of like trade and bartering and
Mm-hmm.
so on going on. Um, if I recall correctly, I think they might have just been, doing whatever they could to, scrap up enough money to take care of the family because, of course, we're talking about a time where the male was basically that primary source of income while the wife or the grandmother were there to care for the children. And so my understanding, and there's a lot about that time in her life where there isn't a lot of detail on or information.
Right.
Um,
Mm-hmm.
and I think, there was just too much trauma that went on, especially early in her life, that she would talk about, but not like openly, not unless you were asking her about it. And
Mm-hmm.
so, um, you know, that's not really, much that she would discuss because obviously you're talking about her dad dying at 2, and then, when she was in her
She didn't even know
teens.
him. Yeah.
Yeah, and
Mm-hmm.
then in her teens, the rest of the family was separated from her, and she found herself alone. Um,
Do
it's
you know
crazy.
when it is that she and her family were taken to Auschwitz?
Yeah, so my understanding is that her family, the rest of her living family at the time, which you mentioned was her grandmother, her mother, and her sister,
Mm.
I think, they all were taken away to the camp.
Okay.
Um, she was able to, you can say escape, but she wound up in another town, basically, living in squalor until she was captured and taken into Auschwitz.
Mm.
And so there's, her oral history, the interview that was done with her. Um,
Mm-hmm.
it in areas can be a little hard to understand her because her
Mm-hmm.
English is broken, and
Mm-hmm.
but a lot of it you can understand. It's just that there are, I think it's a little bit scattered also as far as her
Yeah.
thought process, which again is something that happens to trauma victims, or especially, I
Mm-hmm.
mean, you're talking about somebody who's trying to not only recall some of the worst and most traumatic of situations that anyone could even envision, but also she's trying to do it in a second language that's not her primary language, and she's also she's not well. She was
Mm-hmm.
never her mental state of mind was always uh, a mess for the rest of
Yeah.
her life. So, I mean, to me, it was like in some ways a little bit cryptic and hard to um, make a lot of sense out of when you listen to her oral history. But I mean, for the bulk of it, I understood. So, again, going back to what happened to the family, it's kind of hard to say. We just know that they were taken away and she never saw or heard from them ever again. And so she was the only surviving member of her immediate family.
And she had, I think one of the things that got to me is she doesn't even have photos of her
The
family, and therefore you don't have photos of your family.
No, and the earliest photo I have of her is the photo on the front cover of the book, which is a
Mm-hmm.
portrait of her. Which it's interesting because when you look at it, it's almost like she was posing for like a glamour magazine, like Madame was, that like a front cover. Like if you think about it, she looks like
Yeah,
she
she looks very pretty,
Yeah,
and
it's like
yeah,
a very kind of glamorous look with her hair, her head covered with a scarf. Um,
not really a smile, but just kind of
no,
almost like a,
that blank
hey,
stare.
you
Yeah,
know.
it's kind of like a blank stare, and I
Yeah.
almost see it. It's in a weird way. It kind of reminds me of like Mona Lisa. Like if you look
Mm-hmm.
at Mona Lisa's face, that that's kind of the vibe I got. And so yeah, I found this photo amongst some, family, I guess you'd call them heirlooms, but like different photos that my mom had. And I thought, what a best, I mean, probably the best way to capture her in a moment where she does have a bit of joy in her face because the photo was taken in a displaced persons camp right after she was liberated or sometime thereafter,
Mm.
and she was transitioning into a new life. She met my grandfather, and they
Maybe had a
eventually,
little bit of hope.
yeah. And so that's like that photo to me does give a little bit of a hopeful outlook on.
How old do you think she is here?
Oh, let me think. It's
She's
probably,
born in 21. She was born, dude. My grandmother, who I love more than anything on my father's side, Grandma Bud, who I write about in my
yeah.
book, was born in July of 1921.
Mhm.
And she was born in August of 1921.
So
So
let's
this
think
has got to
about this.
be,
28 years old. Yeah, about
yeah,
28, 27, 28 years old she is in this photo.
because she was
Um,
liberated in 45,
mhm.
April of 45.
Yeah, and so I would guess this might be about 47 because they did not leave to the United States until 1949. So it's probably within those 3 to 4. It has to be within those like 3 years or so, 46, 47, 48. But
She's got to be skinny as hell. And you just can't
yeah,
see it because it's a
but
portrait,
or
but
she maybe had started to put on a little bit of weight, because her
maybe.
face looks a little bit fuller,
Mm-hmm.
than what you would expect coming out of the. I mean, we've seen photos of how emaciated people are, but the entirety of her life, she was a very frail little lady.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I never saw her actually like moving very quickly ever. She was very
Mm-hmm.
slow in her movements, and the amount she would consume to eat was usually quite minimal, which I think again ties into the fact that she was living for, some time with very little to eat. And so
That
she,
was her childhood, though, too.
yeah,
I
her
mean, if you
entire,
think
you're
about it.
right.
So,
Yeah.
yeah.
And yeah, she wasn't like raised in any, form of wealth, so they probably just had like porridge or soup. Um,
Yeah. And I
old
wonder, too,
country
like,
stuff.
because you describe her in the book as you mentioned that she's frail and obviously what this did to her mentally and then that she wanted to share the story, but at the same time it was hard to share the story. And I kind of wonder like if her upbringing had been so difficult and then she's forced into this atrocity and I could just imagine people with maybe better circumstances in their lives where they come from doctors or lawyers or wealthy families and the shock of losing that
Yeah, yeah,
family where, hey, I want a piece of bread or a piece of cake and it's right there, and you don't have to worry about stuff like that. But that's pretty much was her whole life until she at least got over here. And I wonder if that's what she may have looked frail, but she's a strong woman at the same time to be able to get through all that.
yeah, exactly. And so I think, it's the old don't judge a book by its cover type of situation where you look at a person like that who's so, frail or thin and looks traumatized, and you don't realize how tough they really are.
Yeah.
You know, at least the toughness that um is it's not human. Like
Mm-hmm.
you
Mm-hmm.
have to be you know beyond a normal mortal to be able to overcome uh you know the types of things that a lot of people seeking asylum witness or experience themselves,
I think I think most people, if they have some sort of education of the Holocaust, would know Auschwitz. It's one of the most um, commonly known concentration camps, and it was a death camp. Was it not, or was it a work camp? Does it
it
matter?
was
They're
a
all death
yeah, I
camps, aren't
mean,
they?
it was a death camp. But I mean, like you said, all camps were
Yeah,
in one way or another a death camp because you know thousands and tens of thousands and more people died a weekly basis in those camps. So
right. And it says, you say in the book that she was face to face with Dr. Mengele. So, for those who may not know, Dr. Mengele is a notorious Nazi doctor that would have the concentration camp victims come before him. They would stand out there in the cold naked, and he would just sit there at a little thing and
yeah,
say, "You go left, you go right, and decide who lives and who dies." And luckily, she got to go to the correct line.
yeah. So in her oral history, when she talked about that, she was basically saying that they were taken out into this like courtyard area, and Mangala was there, and she wound up getting sent to Bergen-Belsen. And
Mm-hmm.
it kind of, let's see, where was it? So she said it in her, I just looked it up in her oral testimony. Um, and thankfully they transcribed it too. Um, she said in Auschwitz one day, Mangala was his name. You hear the name before, I'm sure. And he took all the people out. Again, on a special. It wasn't by the barracks because my barrack would only take so much. He took all the people in a big place and he took out some people. I was between them, I was. And put us, they took this number off. I mean, we don't belong there anymore. And so she goes on and then explains how she wound up in Bergen-Belsen. And basically that she was not selected to go to her death, even though she, was pretty much dead on the inside. Her soul had been ripped out of
Absolutely.
her
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
completely. And she talks about it in her oral testimony, and I had to hear about it, much of her life, the remainder of her
Mm-hmm.
life, when I would hear her talk about how, terrible life is, because she was never able to come. So yeah, I mean, that that's pretty wild that the guy who sent, I think, more people to their death than anybody else, um and I think his nickname was the Angel of Death, um
Yep.
that she actually was in a line and selected to go to her to life. I mean, she was selected to go to life, so to speak, than being sent to death. And it even says that he was a member of a team of doctors who selected victims to be sent to gas chambers, and she talked about that also. That's they would send him to the gas chambers, or she talked about the smell of the death that came from the ovens. Um, it's all very morbid, obviously.
Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
think it also shaped my sense of humor, which is a little warped. Um, in that,
So is mine.
yeah. Well, when you hear stories about like
Yeah.
ovens and people getting cooked, it's like, you know, it's not funny, obviously, but I think that it shifted me to realize that, you never know what's going to happen from one day to the next and how we're going to uh, either be put in a situation like that, or you just never know what's coming around the corner. So you just got to be able to look at life as, a pleasant experience and do the best you can with it, even though it's
Yeah.
pretty hard for a lot of people. But I feel very fortunate. And that's part of, my reason for writing this book, because I feel that I'm privileged and I have an ability to write something and share a story that she wasn't able to actually do, you know.
Hmm. Hmm. Um, so she ends up, as you said, she gets sent to Bergen-Belsen, and then April 15th, 1945, the British liberated Bergen-Belsen.
Mhm.
But you also said that at one point she ended up, the Soviet troops, when they invaded, she ended up being put on a death march as well. And she survived. So she not only survived her childhood being poor and all this, then she survives losing her family, Auschwitz, Bergen-Belsen, and a death march as well.
Yeah, and during the death march, she was obviously thinking a lot of thoughts about just, you know, not wanting to be alive. And I think at one point she described putting dirt on her arms to try and cover up some of the, wounds or open wounds that she had, because if the guards saw that somebody was like deteriorating like that, you were more likely to get killed.
Hmm.
And you know, she talks about how like she almost, didn't want to, but it seemed like mixed feelings. Like, do you want to be alive? Do you want to, like, if we got hit with a nuclear, bomb, and only a small percentage survived, do you want to actually survive that? I don't know. I mean,
Yeah, I mean, I could see like on these death marches and in the stories from them, a lot of people are just like, I just can't go any further, and you just sit
yeah.
down and wait to die, or hope that they come by and put a bullet in your head and just get it over with, I
So
would
it talks
think.
a lot about her own fortitude and
Mm-hmm.
resilience, because most humans wouldn't be able to survive it physically or mentally.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I have to say that like because we've talked about this a lot, as we've talked about your book privately, and I had always thought that when the war started, and for a long time, they would tell us in the United States, oh, we didn't know what they were doing to the Jews, and we found out, and this and that, but now we know, yeah, they knew the whole time what they were doing to the Jews,
Yeah.
and they were okay with that. And I know about which is it, the St. Louis, I think it was, that came here with the ship, and we turned them away, and we said, no, we're not going to accept you all. And a lot of those people ended up going back to Auschwitz. um And I always had the impression, and I think I'm wrong about this though, is that after the war, then we realized what was done in the concentration camps, and our politicians and our leaders then allowed Jewish people to come here. But it was still on an extremely limited basis, was it not?
Yeah. So, I mean, the numbers were much greater than they ever had admitted previous to then. But there were still, limitations. Uh, the only way that my family was able to get here was through sponsorship of an immigrant rights organization called the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society,
Mm-hmm.
also known as HIAS. And HIAS has been very active in recent times with helping migrants who are coming through the Darien Gap or areas down in Central America into Mexico, and even up at the Mexican American border. this organization still is out there, doing God's work, and they were the ones that sponsored and were able to get my family here. But when you think about the odds, and what are the odds that a family can get out of that situation and make it, to the United States, um, very slim, not great. And now it's almost impossible for you to legally get, into the US through a process outside of, just getting to the border and asking for help for asylum. Uh, and so they were fortunate. They were fortunate to be able to come here. They came on the USS Hershey uh, on a carrier and came through the New York Harbor.
So essentially, she's liberated in 1945, and it takes 3 years, 1948, is when the Americans started supporting the limited. When did she come here? Was
They
it in
came
48?
in 49.
49.
So my
Okay.
mom was born October 7th of 1948 in Germany. Um, and then they went, I think they came over about 6 months or so later.
I just find that really amazing that Esther's gone through all this, and she meets a man and falls in love and is able to do that. I mean, I think it's just been so hard for me to even feel, and I haven't gone near through what your grandmother went through.
Yeah.
And I just can't imagine entering a relationship and having a child. But I mean, what else is she going to do back then?
It's
Certainly.
also it's it's just nature. It happens. Like
Mm
it's a
hmm. Mm hmm.
natural thing for somebody to want to find a companion and fall in love and have a family. And I mean, from all accounts, she was a good parent too.
Mm
I
hmm.
mean, this could have gone horribly wrong for her or for, her spouse, as far as the trauma and whether, it ultimately drives them to drinking or, other types of issues.
Domestic
But we don't,
violence.
yeah, but you
Mm hmm.
didn't really see that from
Yeah.
this generation of folks. I mean, you would see some with like alcohol issues, but you didn't see a lot of like the domestic violence or, perpetual violence. Um, and I think part of it is because they had seen so much so horrible that, you know, it's something you don't want to impose on anybody else.
Yeah. Yeah. You tell an interesting story that I think there's a lot of relevance to today,
Yeah,
obviously, and I think obviously this is why you wrote this book as an immigration attorney as well. But um, you tell a story about how even American Jewish people did not want the Holocaust refugees. And you describe why that is, but I think that's a very important story because we see a lot of that now when we think about Latinos for Trump and people, who are like, oh no, maybe my family came here undocumented way back then, but things have changed, and now we kind of have people here. So, can you describe that story?
sure. And so, there's a lot of back turning that goes on. Um, and we've seen that everywhere over time. People get their modicum of economic success, and or they have a place that they can call their own, and then they don't want others to enjoy or relish that same sort of benefit, and so they turn their back. It's called back turners, or
Mm-hmm.
shut the door on them. And in the case of Esther, So she and Morris, my grandfather, were here at I think it was like a Friday night meal, Shabbat dinner, and one of the relatives, like a distant relative of theirs, was at the table, and she talks about this again. Everything in the book that I talk about related to her or my other grandfather, who I'll talk about in a second, Harry, because Morris, my biological grandfather, had passed away. So Esther remarried Harry, and they were together. That Harry was the grandfather I knew because Morris
Mm.
passed away before I was born, and she remarried. And so I always knew Harry as my grandfather.
Mhm.
But both of their stories are uh, in the archives, the Holocaust Museum, uh, through the Shoah Foundation, and the University of Michigan interviewed them both back in the 1980s. I think it was 1984. And so when you look at the story, one of the things she talks about is being at the Shabbat dinner and this man who did not realize that she did understand a small amount of English was lamenting the fact that the Jews were coming after World War II. And he was saying the same sort of stuff we hear from people today, which is that they were coming here and taking jobs away and business away from him, and how that was terrible, and how Hitler should have just killed them and killed them all. And she describes being shocked by that because you get this vision of this idyllic, kind of almost like a utopian vision of the United States as a place where you'll be welcome, but
Mhm.
the reality couldn't be further from the truth. That
Mhm.
it is not that melting pot that we were educated about. It is a melting pot, but it's not in the sense that people are just like, yeah, sure, come on over. This is a great, it's
Mhm.
the shiny beacon on the hill, that sort of stuff. So for her to hear that is like even double trauma because she's now feeling like, am I welcome in my you know, own home or in
With
this
her own
land
people.
with my own people who don't even
Yeah.
want me here. And so
Mhm.
when you look at how it correlates to what's happening today, again, we're talking about history repeating itself. Like,
Mhm.
what the fuck are these people doing voting for Donald Trump? Like that
Yeah.
is the most insane shit ever. Like I read this op-ed from a young man in Chicago who wrote about how he was born here and his parents were not legal, so he's a beneficiary of birthright citizenship. He's
Mhm.
a gay man whose mother is undocumented and has been previously deported. And the piece he wrote basically, you know, makes it sound like she's back here after she was previously deported. And he has other undocumented family, and he's he's got a college education and he's reaped all the benefits of this country. And yet he wrote a piece for the Chicago Tribune, uh, basically lauding the fact that Trump won and that he supports Trump. And I was like, synapses exploding in my body, just blowing up in my brain, going, what the fuck are people doing? Like, why are you voting against your interest? I'm not saying that, Biden or any other president is, the greatest thing since sliced bread, because I don't believe in, that sort of mentality, like the MAGA mentality that we're going
Mhm.
to,
Mhm.
put somebody up on a pedestal. They're all cut from the same cloth. They're all politicians at the end of the day. Um, and so it's just like, what the hell? Like this guy is sitting at a dinner table talking about how he wished she died at the hands of Hitler, basically
Mm-hmm.
saying that.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm like, what the hell? Like, I just don't understand, how cruel the level of cruelty that we see in our society. It boggles the mind to me.
He'll probably be singing a different tune once they get a hold of him and deport him because
Yeah.
by Trump's own, they want to do away with that birthright
Birthright
citizenship.
citizenship. Yeah.
I don't know if
And
they'll be able to
I
do
don't think
it,
they
but
could. I mean, and then is it retroactive? I personally said, all right, if you're going to do it, go all the way and strip the citizenship of Donald Trump Jr. Please, please strip his citizenship, and all the other Trump kids, because all of them were born to a foreigner.
hmm
And I think,
Barron as well. And apparently
yeah,
Melania came here and worked illegally.
yeah,
So,
lead by example. Let's
that's
get
right.
Donald Trump Jr.'s citizenship removed before everybody else. Yeah,
Yeah.
obviously wishful thinking, but yeah, I mean, it's just like they're gonna come for you. They're gonna come for your family, and you don't care. You don't care. You not only do you not care, like this guy who wrote this piece, but he's bragging about it in one of the
hmm
largest
hmm
newspapers in the country. And
hmm
I mean, the response to it was pretty, vitriolic. I mean, people were like, "What the hell are you doing?" But there's a part of society, a segment out there saying, "Good for you, kid." Like,
Yeah, it's that same segment that becomes Border Patrol agents and doesn't understand why the Border Patrol is so racist and won't promote them into
yeah,
management. And it's like, I would always laugh at those guys. I'm like, you do know that we're a racist organization, right? And we're led by white people, right? And so you see me as a white person. I'm going to tell you, you're never going to be white enough. You're never going to be white enough.
can
And
I
that's just
tell
the way it
you,
is.
Border Patrol, and this is actually this is more ICE related, but
Mm-hmm.
I think you'd find this interesting or appalling or both combined. So I have a client who just won her asylum, which is so hard to do, to win an
Mm-hmm.
asylum case in 2024 because there are so many layers, barriers that are put up to basically tilt the whole case against the immigrant. So she wins her asylum. Not only did she win her asylum, the judge said to us that it was probably one of the most well documented of cases she's seen, as far as the evidence goes, because it's very hard to document those cases.
Right.
And yet, the ICE attorney was still trying to kind of fight it. And I mean, I get it's kind of their job, but they need to sometimes know when to roll over and let it go. Um, and at the end of the case, the judge granted the asylum, and ICE waived appeal, which is the best possible scenario. And what will happen next is my client is going to get a permit called 994, which will allow her to be an asylee and live here and work, and then
Mm-hmm.
eventually get a green card, along with her two young daughters. So she gets her asylum, and she still had a check in with ICE enforcement, the ICE
Yep.
Enforcement and Removal Operations Office. So she asked me, she's like, "Well, I just won my asylum case. Do I need to go and check in?" And I said, "Yeah, you definitely need to go and talk to them and let them know that you were granted your asylum and give them a copy of the decision." So, because even though ICE, the legal department, is part of ICE, the enforcement and removal department, they
Mm-hmm.
don't always have the same
They don't talk to each
information.
other.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's so typical. So she goes
Mm-hmm.
in and she went in on Friday of this past week. I think it was December the 13th. She goes in, and the the ICE agent who she checks in with was visibly angry that she was granted her asylum. And not only was he mad, but he told her she had to check in again in January,
Just to be a dick.
which is an abuse of power.
Uh-huh.
It's being a dick, and it goes to the culture that we're dealing with, which
Mm-hmm.
is we've let people who, should never be in any position of power be in those positions. And
Mm-hmm.
guys like him are going to get promoted because they're
Mm-hmm.
bigger dicks. So I was pretty incensed by that. And we'll see. I'm going to give them an earful on Monday because they should not, the guy should have said, congratulations, shook her hand, carry on with your life.
Yeah, exactly. Last I heard, a judge is superior to an ICE agent, correct?
That is
Hmm.
correct. And so
Yeah.
even though it is an administrative judge, it's not,
Mm-hmm.
they're through the Department of Justice agency. Um, they still have the power to make that decision. And once they make that decision, and ICE decided to waive appeal, meaning they're not even going to appeal the case, which means the case is done. It's all
Yeah.
done. Yeah,
Yeah.
and yet the guy said come back in. So to kind of go back to the original point, we're looking at situations where people who have power impose their power illegally over other people, and that's not a good thing for our society. And the people who are doing it a lot of times now are even of the same race as the people that are being checked in with them, like the ICE agents. Many of them are Hispanic or Latino, and they're doing this to people with their same you know racial composition, which
Mm-hmm.
it's not only inherently racist, but it's also, you know, kind of nuts when you see people doing it to their own, in a sense.
It's insane.
Yeah,
It's insane.
it really is. So yeah, I mean, I feel like that's where people like you and I need to come in and be the mouthpiece for the truth on these things, and share these stories, and let the media know what's going on so they can report on it.
I think more than anything, what the book does is you can see without even trying, without even needing your help, though you give the help in your perspective as an immigration attorney and you explain it for people who don't understand the system and why it works this way. It it really ties, what was going on in the 1920s to 19 up until probably the 50s, early 50s, but to what we're going through today. And I think some of the lessons that you give in the book are very um, important for what we're going through today. I will say that, like, last time we talked, you had asked me, it was an interview at the Holocaust Center,
Yeah.
um, and at the synagogue in Tucson. And you read a piece of my book and you were talking about how I don't like to compare Border Patrol agents to Nazis, even though a lot of people do that. And you asked me, what about today? Because my book is like 2.5 years old, and I think for a lot of Americans, maybe a lot of people in Western culture, and I think it's an excuse, but a lot of people will say, it's not like Trump is like Hitler. He's not building gas chambers. He's not doing all these other things, and so they get really upset when we make that comparison.
Yeah.
And it's like, and it does a disservice to Holocaust victims. But a lot of people who say that tend to be people who don't even believe in the Holocaust half the time, to be honest with you. And I don't think it has to be, he did this just like Hitler did, and he did this like just like, people want it to be exactly the same. But some of the lessons that you give in the book, which show the similarities between the two, and maybe we just haven't gotten there yet, is fear drives and dictates immigration policies. Can you
Exactly.
talk about that?
Well, I will. And I'll also, kind of tell you a short story of a situation where I came face to face with Carrie Lake. And Carrie Lake is the
And you survived.
yeah, well, that's why the book's called The Last Survivor. Um,
Yeah, there you
but
go.
I survived. I should make a T-shirt like survived
Survived Carrie
Carrie
Lake.
Lake. But Carrie Lake, who is the ultimate example of uh, losing or failing upwards. Her
Hmm.
upwards mobility has been astounding considering she has lost the race for the Senate, the race for the governor, and now all of a sudden she's going to be the voice of fucking America. So I walked up to Carrie Lake at an event, dressed up like a Yahoo, like I should at a Carrie Lake event. And but how do I
Very patriotic, I think,
yeah,
is
how
what
do
you're
I
trying to say, right?
describe a Yahoo? I was wearing a T-shirt with Beavis and Butthead and the American flag. I was wearing a very shiny, sequiny cowboy hat and these big
Hmm.
goofy glasses. I looked the part. I looked like I was at a MAGA rally. But I walked up to her and I said, "Carrie, I wrote this book." Um, and I also wanted to show you, and I showed her the badge that my grandfather wore in the
Hmm.
Buchenwald camp, and she was riveted. She looked at it, and
Like I was when I saw it.
yeah, but I
Yeah.
knew I had like roped her in, like accomplished my mission there because I had a riveting audience and a
Hmm.
riveted audience, and she started looking at the book, and I said, "Yeah, I wrote the book about my grandparents and their Holocaust journey and their immigration story to the US." And she started flipping through it, and then she turned to there was a chapter about SB 1070,
Hmm.
which talks about the Arizona state law SB 1070, which was basically the precursor to this whole like Trumpism mentality of deport them
Hmm.
all, or the idea of attrition through enforcement, where you create laws and policies that will subject people to so much hardship that they'll want to leave and move to another place, which is the idea uh, of attrition through enforcement. And then this bill SB 1070 that became wildly unpopular in Arizona, um, by many businesses and individuals who saw the economic impact it had, negative economic impact. So, anyways, I showed her the book. She looks at that section of the book, and then all of a sudden, she starts to suspect that I'm a mole and that I am not a Trump supporting Yahoo. So she then looks at me and goes, and this takes me back to the question of fear. She goes, "What did you think of SB 1070? Did you think it was good for Arizona or not?" And I looked at her and I said, "This was really bad for our state. We lost a lot of business. We lost a lot of, um, you know, good people who fled. It left people in a state of fear. And it was just a bad policy and law all around." She then looks at me and says, "Well, do you think the Holocaust," and she wrote about your grandparents and the Holocaust story, "do you believe that what happened in the Holocaust is comparable to SB 1070?"
Oh,
Which
fuck.
she saw that as her gotcha moment. Now, what Carrie didn't know at the time was that she was talking to somebody who may not have failed upwards in life like she has,
Mm.
but is a lot sharper than she is. And what
Hmm.
I did is I looked at her and I immediately said, both the Holocaust and SB 1070 had the same exact intention, and that was dehumanization.
Hmm.
She looked at me and just kind of nodded her head, and she didn't say anything else for about 10 seconds. And then she went to the default comment, which is, well, what about Biden bringing in all these tens of millions of immigrants? And then at that point, I knew, all right, it's time to
Yeah.
move on, Carrie.
You
Here's my
start
book.
throwing out
You
fake
can,
stats and
yeah,
all that stuff.
you can take my book and throw it in the dumpster. That's fine. But in comparison to this idea of fear and what you were talking about, what's happened is we've created a culture of fear where if you make people fearful enough, you can force them to believe in anything. And
Hmm.
that's kind of what the Nazis did. Fear the Jews, fear the gypsies, fear the gays. You know, it's the
Hmm.
same sort of idea that if you fear the other, you will want to do what it takes to either remove the other or to, do some horrible shit to them. And that's, you know, I think is a way to encapsulate what Trumpism is about, which is we create enough fear in our society. And I'm not even saying it's Trumpism. I mean, it is, but this is something that's been around for, decades or centuries, like in different, in different iterations. But in the area of what we're living in modern times here in the United States, this idea of let's create fear to, you know, to commoditize our prison system, to, we're using humans as a commodity so that wealthy corporations can keep getting richer and richer and richer, and people can get jobs. I mean, it's a huge job creator when you look at all the private prisons and where they put them. Florence,
Hmm.
Arizona. I mean, the biggest, uh, you
Is
know,
it Eloy, I think is there? Or
Eloy
Florence
and
and Eloy,
Florence,
yeah.
Eloy and Florence, they are basically prison. They're prisons
They're
like
prisons.
with a little town surrounding the prison. I mean,
Hmm.
that's basically it. Like in Florence, you drive through, there's the state prison, there's federal prison, there's immigration detention, there's a county jail. And what industry is number one in hiring in those areas? The
Hmm.
prison
Hmm.
industry, the enforcement. And that, so what we've seen is fear being used to pad the wallets of, corporations and wealthy people and governors, or not even governors, but politicians in general that are profiting off of this uh this fear, the concept of fear. And that, you know, that we see they take the most extreme example, like Lake and Riley, horrific situation. I mean, really, it's horrific what
Hmm.
happened to her. No, I wouldn't want that to happen to my daughter, my wife, to anybody. Um, but they take that and they put that up as the example. That is the example. The guy who shot the migrant out in San Francisco on the pier. I don't know if you remember that. I don't even remember if
Yeah.
he was the one that did the shooting, but he was a guy who had been previously deported. This I think she was just like a tourist, got accidentally killed, and then, of course, Trump took it and used that to scapegoat all immigrants. And so that's, fear is probably the most powerful thing that you can impose on another person.
It's interesting when I was watching Aaron Rylick Mellon, I think.
Oh,
I'm probably saying his
Melnick, yes.
thank you. I just call him Aaron the stat guy.
Yeah. He's
And
the smart one.
yeah, he works in immigration group. I think it's American Immigration
American
Council.
Immigration Council in DC.
Yeah, and he's really good with statistics. And he recently, this last week, I think, was testifying before Congress. And of course, the Republicans were just all just irate and mentioning this victim and everything. And I just, he's done it so many times. He's professional, and he keeps his keeps his cool and everything. But I wanted to list off the victims of, Juan David Ortiz, the Border Patrol agent, supervisory agent who was a serial killer. Why aren't you all upset about that? Is it because his victims were Latinas? Is that what, And so we could play that game back and forth all we want to, and it's part of the problem. I think is everybody just they're just constantly fighting and showboating up there, and it just has gotten to the point where you can't even have a discussion and try and figure out what is it that we need to do in this and that, because I think one side already knows what they want to do, and they're just, they don't want to actually find out the real results. It's just how to get to their ultimate goal of putting everybody in a prison and making a lot of money off of them.
If the government wanted to enact a logical solution to this problem, they would have done it a long time ago.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It's not worth it to them. The lobbying that's done and the amount of money that's being made by law enforcement, by prisons, by military, contractors, they have no incentive whatsoever to fix the problem. That's why I think, like, people who uh are padding their pockets from big pharma and or the insurance agencies. I mean, it's just too corrupt at the end of the day. There's just too much money to be made, and if you try to buck the trend, you're going to get steamrolled. You're going to get, somebody, they're going to run somebody against you and you're going to be out. I mean, that's what makes somebody like Bernie, a unique figure in politics, because he is not, hindered by those outside influences.
Right.
It puts him in a unique position, especially based off of where he's located, because most people who would be like Bernie, um, or to some extent AOC or Ilhan or some of these other politicians who, if they were in any other district, they'd probably be a one-termer, in
Mm-hmm.
certain
Mm-hmm.
places. So, I mean, yeah, it's a sad state of affairs out there, and it's all because of the mighty dollar. I always go back to like some of those Rage Against the Machine songs, or videos where they're showing you know the the oppression that our own country does to people.
Lately everybody's been talking about the assassination of this CEO, healthcare CEO, and things like that. And I keep seeing people of privilege, typically white people and people in media, being like, "When did we get to this point?" And I'm like, oh, "We've been here. We've been here a long time, sweeties." And I keep going back to our asylum system essentially consists of making you run the gauntlet of what I call a death obstacle course. Because, like we've talked about this before, like the demographics of who was coming here changed drastically from when I was an agent in the 90s to Obama, when the majority started becoming asylum seekers. And the narrative that the government and the politicians and the media has given is that migrants are just migrants. Like, there's no difference between a refugee and an asylum seeker, or why people come here, or people who come here for workers' permits or other things. And so they just lump them all together. And our policy is to meter and limit who can apply legally, even though we're saying everybody should do it legally. They're metering and limiting who can do it. And the actual asylum system has become if you can get across the river, if you can make it through the mountains Jen used to work at, if you can make it through the Sonoran Desert, then you might be able to live here. That's pretty much the asylum system, I think, for the majority of people trying to get asylum in the United States. And when you have an entire system that is based on intentionally and knowingly sending people to their deaths, I mean, and we ignore it. And in fact, one of my neighbors just discovered my book and she's become a super fan. And and um and so she's gone around to a lot of the white men that live in my neighborhood and told them about this book, and they've all decided that I'm a liar and they're going to confront me, and I'm like, first of all, no. And second of all, it's just like I am astounded that people do not know that there are over 50,000 bodies out there from these policies. And they act like I'm crazy. And I'm like, no, I
But
used to do that job. And they just don't want to believe it, Mo.
here's the thing. One of the reasons I wrote this book was because of the fear of people forgetting our history or turning a blind eye to what's happening around you.
Mm-hmm.
And I started thinking about the fact that, survivors of the Holocaust are all going to die.
Mm-hmm.
And how are we going to memorialize them, remember them? And are people going to? And are people going to start to progressively forget, even, and they have already, that this
Mm-hmm.
actually happened, or don't even want to acknowledge it because it's such an astounding thing? Like, I think, when you say 50,000 bodies in the desert, just right, miles and miles down the road, to some people, that's just, it's hard to believe that happened. And if you say 6 million died because of this genocide, and let's say 40 or 50 years from now, somebody might be, you know, that's not even possible. That's not humanly possible. It never happened. So when I was thinking about writing a book, my thought process was exactly that. Like, which is why you wrote your book. You know what I mean? Like,
Mm-hmm.
it is
Yeah.
because we need to be the truth tellers. We are the ones who are, bucking that trend, which is a scary and unfortunate trend that's going on of people who are just believing complete bullshit.
Mm-hmm.
It's fucking irritating. And the moment you tell them the truth and the facts, they call you a liar. They say you're full of
Yeah.
shit. But the reality is, it's the opposite. Like, they are just not allowing they're just not allowing the ability to clearly understand that this is actually happening. Systematically, people are dying. And, like you said, we make asylees run the gauntlet. But even when they win, even when they get onto that, that hill where they finally have been granted and they're overjoyed by that, they go into an ICE appointment and the ICE agent is mad and wants to take it out on them.
It's having a
So
bad day.
yeah,
Mm-hmm.
every
Yeah.
day's a bad fucking day. Even
Yeah.
though you're
Mm-hmm.
collecting a good paycheck, you get
Mm-hmm.
government benefits, you have no right to be, you know, mad
Yeah.
about what you're
Yeah.
doing, and you don't have to be a dickhead about it. I mean,
Yeah.
that's the reality. Like, and so for these guys who want to confront you, or who think that you're lying, you know, it's just they're just being the pure, basic, typical machismo, ignorant douchebags
Yeah.
that are not going to. You're not going to change their mind. You know what I
No,
mean?
and I know that I've got to explain
Yeah.
that to my neighbor because she's like, "Well, you need
She
to talk
thinks
to them," and
that
I'm like, "No, I don't need to talk to them.
yeah.
I know who these men are."
And I know there's a lot of people out there whose mind I'm not going to change, but I do
Right.
feel that there are a lot of moldable people that we can shift some of that dialogue in favor of humanity and being humane, because I do think there is an inherent humaneness to most, if not any human. It's about their nurturing, and I talk about in the book also nature versus nurture. Like, how does Stephen Miller turn out to be a monster?
Right.
And his background was, you know, not too different from mine. Raised in a
Right.
Jewish household, I think like conservative Judaism.
Mhm.
Um, we both were kind of privileged. We both
Mhm.
privileged white men and straight, and we didn't have to, feel fear
Mhm.
that,
Mhm.
although some might say as a Jew you might, but I never felt that.
Mhm.
I never felt discriminated against. I grew up in
Mhm.
Tucson, Arizona, and so I just think that some of it really is the nurturing part. Like, how are you raised? What are you surrounded by? Or what have you surrounded yourself with? Because it seems like a lot of his family totally disagree with his position on immigrants. Yeah. So
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think we're running out of time, but I wanted
that's all
to.
right.
One of the quotes you put in your book is, "We need to be consistently reminded that our privilege of being American also requires compassion towards others." Because I would say right now, in the era that we're in, compassion is seen as being
It's
weak,
woke. If you're
woke.
compassion, you're woke. And
Yeah.
I feel like, one of the privileges we have as Americans is that we do have an abundance of resources as a society. And we use them quite often for the wrong reasons, whether it be, again, incarceration, detention, um, not trying to focus on some of the root causes for, homelessness or drug abuse, mental
Mhm.
health, and and I think, we should be driven more by compassion than by the hatred that we've seen from a large segment of our society. It is very hate based, hate fueled. The rhetoric is hate based. The idea that people can walk around with signs that say mass deportation, stuff like that, those are symbols of hate. And I think we are privileged, um, for many reasons in this country. Again, it's not perfect. It's flawed in many different ways, but we do have the privilege to help other people and be driven by compassion, which has worked. I mean, I think in some ways it really is the reason why the United States has been successful, in the development of industry and in industrial work and high tech and so on. It's because, you know for better or worse, we have cultivated a lot of uh, people, from immigrants from other lands, um, that have brought their unique ideas and skills and, um, research and so forth. So I think, you know the more that we do that, the better it is. I think if we did a full-blown cost benefit, you would see that the amount of economic benefit would far outweigh any sort of risk of having the other in on our land. And I just talked to David Beer on my podcast, Immigration
Oh
Made
yeah.
Easy, the Cato Institute researcher, an economist, and he crunches all those numbers and shows how, if we just legalized the 10, 20 million or whatever people in this country, the amount of economic boon it would have on our country over X number of years, and extrapolating that over time, would be just an enormous number versus the negative amount of money that we pump into trying to just deport, massive amount of people, and to talk about also the impossibility of trying to do so. It's just, I mean, they can try and they might be successful in some regard, but I think, it's going to be really damn hard to, I think, chase down and deport millions and millions of people.
Did you see? I think it was Aaron, the stat guy from
Yeah.
DC, put out a post on Blue Sky saying that the Republicans had just submitted a bill that is to increase essentially the three immigration agencies, Border Patrol, CBP, and ICE, increase their budget by like, I want to say it's some kind of billion number. It's outrageous. And he said it is literally the combination of years, decades worth of increases in their budget. And it's all to run this mass deportation. And I think when people think about mass deportations, they just think about officers getting them, and obviously, but somebody's got to build the camp. Then you got to have people to process. Then you got to have people to watch them. Then you got to have private security. Then you got to have people to take care of the kids. Then you got to have people to feed them. Then you have to have medical. Then you have to have it's humongous. And what would save money is actually if you invested just a little bit of money into CBP and asylum and have them actually build an asylum system with asylum officers and inspect people, and then you don't have to hold them into camps and all this other stuff. It just it's very
It's all
strange because
backwards thinking.
yeah, Americans will complain and the Republicans will, and Democrats, quite frankly, this is so expensive and blah blah blah. Yeah, because you're making
Yeah,
money
stop
off of all
bitching
this.
about how much you have to pay in taxes and start to look where those taxes are going. You know what I mean?
Exactly.
I mean, you want this, you're asking for it, and then you're bitching when the taxes go up.
Yeah.
It's like, well, maybe we should be looking at where we're allocating these
Uh-huh.
millions and billions of dollars. When we look at that pie on the budget and we see, military, has this enormous chunk of it, and education's like a little sliver. I mean, or immigration, to some extent isn't huge, especially, I mean, the benefits end is mainly fees based. But yeah, it's just nothing makes sense. And that's why I wrote
But
this
it,
book, to try to make a little bit of sense in, maybe as simplistic of a way that you could try to explain a complicated immigration system.
I think you did a great job of it, and I
Well,
want to
so do
remind
I.
people it's called the last. It's called the last. It's called the Last Survivor: Lessons from the Past and the Dying Dream of Freedom by
Hey, can I
Mo
give a shout out?
Goldman.
I want
Yeah.
to give a shout out to my number one fan, Gypsy Lyle, who
Okay.
I will tell to listen to this because I don't know. I mean, she may not even know what a podcast is, but she might. She's in her 80s, 80 or so. This lady
She
showed up.
might.
This lady
Where can
showed
people
up
buy this book, Mo?
on Amazon,
On Amazon?
or um, at Antigone Books in Tucson. Took my book on consignment, and they said if we sell one book, uh, we will ask you to give us two books. And so I sold one book, and now I have two books there. So that's the only
Uh,
other place right now I have it. But Gypsy has come to me and bought 30 copies,
wow.
and she mails it to all of these like friends and family of hers around the country because she
Yeah.
read it and said, this book really helped educate me. She's a
Mm-hmm.
volunteer with the Samaritans, I think,
Okay.
down in South Tucson. But she showed up in my office. She's like, I want, 15 or 10 copies. And then she bought 10 more. And then she bought 10 more. So I've got one fan. I mean, huge fan. I might have two huge fans. We'll
I
see.
mean, it's roughly 125, 126 pages. It doesn't. It's not
It's
I
a
would,
thin
it's a
book.
difficult read because it's an emotional read, but
Yeah.
it's a quick read at the same time, and because you're limited with how much you know about her, but yet you were able to extrapolate the important lessons from her story, and I'm very thankful that we have her story with us, Mo.
I'm
So
just going to tell you, and I'll end with this. You can read this book in a faster amount of time than it will take you to understand a tweet or whatever, a Truth Social post by Donald Trump.
yeah, it's true. It's
This
true.
book, this book will read faster and make more sense than a Donald Trump Truth Social post. So there
Yeah,
you go. That
yeah.
I'm going to put that on the back of the book. Quote from the author.
There you go. It's a very fast read. You
I
should.
was gonna put a made up quote on the back. My mom, I was gonna write uh, the best book ever written by one of my children, and then right under that, Mo's mom.
Well,
Since
that's better than what my mom would have written for my book, but that's okay.
I would have just gone to my mom and said, "Read this quote," and then she'd read it, and I'd say, "All right,
You read it and
I've
then
quoted you on."
there you go. That's that
That's
sneaky
my trick.
attorney in you. You
Yeah.
got her. All right.
So, well,
Well,
thanks for having me. This is
thank
great.
you. I appreciate you being here, and I love you to death, and please give your wife and your lovely family hugs and kisses for me, and can't wait to come back and see